Okay. Anyway, a very, very warm welcome. And Fazal's going to talk today about higher education as a site of diaspora formation. And he'll talk about 40 minutes and then stop, and then we'll have an opportunity for lots of discussion. So welcome again, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Louise. I've heard about Sussex for as long as I can remember, but I've never had an opportunity to visit this campus. I have an image of this campus, and I've got to tell you, knowing the 60s universities around the world, this fits the bill. It is almost like a prototype of 60s university, which has actually done some magnificent things over the years and have set up huge number of interesting seminar centers and institutes and has always been interested in global issues for as long as I can remember. So it is probably, in my view, one of the most internationalized universities in UK. Certainly, when you look at the profile of the publication and the academics who work here, and that's how I've known Sussex as a center for work in global studies, in migration studies, in racism, those kind of things. Basically, many of the interests that I have, and yet, quite strangely, I've never been here, and I've spent a huge amount of time in Britain. I did my master's here at the University of Manchester. I did my PhD here at King's College London. I taught here for a little while. I've done a number of sabbaticals here, but never to Sussex. So I want to thank Louise really a lot to actually bringing me out here and for people to be so hospitable and so kind. What I want to do today is actually talk about something that I've been really quite interested in. I've been interested in issues of migration for a long time, as being a migrant myself, as the ways in which migration has been theorized and the ways in which its nature and its understanding of migration has changed. I am one of those people who believes migration ain't what it used to be, and migrant experience is certainly has become transformed. And it has become transformed for a whole range of reasons. But most important reasons is the global mobility of people for a whole range of different reasons, including education, business. And of course, the other way that migration has changed is this thing called the iPhone. It has connected us to people all around the world in ways that was not possible. So the migrant experience is no longer the kind of experience that I had, where I had to abandon my links in India, where I came from, to go to Australia. You don't have to do that. I know people who spend as much as 2 hours per day being connected to their friends and family on a daily basis. And that means there is something that is happening in relation to migration that we need to understand. And this is where the notion of diaspora comes from. I want to actually look at the ways in which we might think about diaspora and the complicated relationship that exists between international education, higher education in particular, migration, and diaspora formation. Those are three areas which dance together. And the dancing produces a whole range of interesting outcomes and a whole range of interesting problematics of the global inequalities and global issues of various kinds. So those are the kind of things that I want to talk about. Higher education as a site of global formation. Now the term formation is very important to me. It comes from the tradition of Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall. It actually says saying diaspora doesn't exist as such, but is constantly in the state of formation. It is developing. In other words, what we are interested in, or what I am interested in, is the state of formation. How does diaspora gets formed, by whom, and for what purpose, and what sort of things they do. That's basically what I am interested in. Diaspora formation. What happened? Yeah. So, I'm going to argue, and this is just simply a summary or highlight of some of the things that I'm going to say, is the relationship between higher education and academic diasporas. See the term academic? You can have business diaspora, you can have academic diaspora, you can have all other kinds of diasporas too. I'll say that. It's complex and dynamic. It's changing. Higher education is increasingly shaped, we know that, around transnational mobility of students and faculty. Mobility has become one of those defining aspects of life and the work of higher education, not only in developed countries, inverted commas, but also quite often developing countries as well. So mobility is very important. Now, academic diasporas now play an important role in the processes of knowledge creation and utilization. A number of people have written about that, okay, that knowledge is now being created in a highly networked ways in which particular groups of people relate to each other in order to produce next formations of knowledge. Wendy Lana has written quite extensively about that, as you know, okay. Higher education institutions view diasporas as a resource to recruit students and build transnational links. So diasporas are being used as assets, if you like, as a resource to recruit students. So if you look at the ways in which recruitment now takes place, it is increasingly as a result of recommendations. And diaspora play a very important role in making those recommendations, but also developing transnational research links. It's the diasporas that work with each other. So, for example, within America, you may have people of Indian background, researchers of Indian background, developing relationship with Indians of Indian background here in this country, and those making. So in other words, networks are formed around diaspora. Now, academic diaspora and their intellectual resources are used in development projects. So in other words, development is now increasingly drawing on diaspora links to actually do those projects. So those are the kind of things that are well and truly established in the literature. Okay, just about every one of those propositions you could find not only one or two papers, but many papers trying to argue various aspects of that particular proposition. Okay, what I want to argue is push this debate further with the use of the notion of formation. Okay, higher education institutions do not only utilize diaspora communities, use them strategically, but are also a site where they are cultivated. In other words, diasporas, academic diasporas or business diasporas that may not exist come into existence at places like this. In other words, there are people who are developing networks while they're international students with people from their own community, from their own background, and then trying to stretch them out in a whole range of ways. So I want to argue that higher education is a site of diaspora formations. In other words, bringing people together in a way that we haven't actually seen. So what I want to do in this paper is I want to show how higher education institutions are now increasingly playing an active role in the formation of business diaspora. In other words, while they're academic, they're forming business diaspora. So they may already be a member of ethnic diaspora, they may already be a member of academic diaspora, but on top of that, they're trying to actually develop a formation for business purposes, assumed to be important in driving developments within the globalizing economy, helping to create new markets and facilitating trade and investment. In other words, diaspora, while they are at higher education institutions, form a view of what opportunities they can build upon using the networks and backgrounds and the relationship that they have to their own country of origin. Okay, and that is what I'm interested in. So in that sense, I'm interested in the processes of diasporization rather than looking at diaspora as a category of people that exist. Okay? So in other words, it's never complete, it's always ongoing, and yet there are processes that you can name and understand that are developing the diaspora for purposes of business, what I call business diaspora. Now, we know that the concept of diaspora is very old indeed, okay, whose uses and meanings have gone major changes over the years. In the last 50 to 60 years, perhaps since the Second World War, that idea of diaspora has acquired new meanings, okay, and has become much more generalized than it was in early part of 20th century, okay. So the older notion of diaspora referred to forced dispersal of a group of people. The newer thinking often refers to any kind of dispersion, not only as a result of exilic experiences, but also people who are forming a group who remain transnationally linked to a whole range of other places. Okay? That's the new question. So in other words, the notion of diaspora has become increasingly closes not to forced dislocation, but dispersal. Much less normatively defined, much less pejorative in one sense. Or the notion of diaspora implied a return to the original homeland. If you like, an imagined fantasy that one day we'll go back to our home. And the home was clearly defined. The newer thinking focuses on dense and ongoing linkages across borders. In other words, how people retain links, okay, and use those links to benefit themselves and the community that are always in the state of formation, okay. Or the notion of diaspora implied integration of migrants into countries of settlement and assimilation. The newer thinking emphasizes cultural hybridity, cultural inventions, creativity, and what's Ulrich called place polygamy. People who can remain connected to one place and another place at the same time simultaneously. In other words, the distinction between there and here collapses. Okay, there being their country of origin and here being where they are living collapses, so that it's the relationship between those two that they find as a interesting space in which to make their life and imagine their futures. Okay, in other words, what you're seeing here is a process whereby you are making links due largely to the availability of technology and so on, okay, and mobility of various kinds, okay, to make sure that the relationships become more denser and denser, so that it can be exploited economically and commercially, okay. There's an exploitation of those links is where business diaspora are now increasingly focused on. So, the newer thinking, this newer thinking on diaspora, theoretically, focuses on processes of transnational formation, or what Hall called diasporization. These processes include an emphasis on dynamism of those processes, how these things are moving constantly and are never static. Political mobilization in leadership. There are groups of people who are mobilizing these people in order to be able to remain connected and have dense relationship with each other and perhaps their country of origin. Discursive construction of the characteristic of diaspora. In other words, diaspora gets spoken about in a whole range of different ways. And forging of identity through transnational connectivity. So you recognize yourself an Indian, like I do, okay, but a different kind of Indian. Not quite an Indian who is a migrant or who is an Indian originally just simply in another place. I belong to another different category. And it's that category that I'm interested in. The person who is neither there nor here but somewhere else. Okay, and exactly where there's somewhere else is discursively constructed for a whole range of purposes. It focuses on the advantages of living in a transnational space. So instead of thinking that it's largely a negative aspect of being elsewhere, it is to see how can we make the best use of it. Okay, how can we use my transnational connectivity as a way of exploiting the conditions in which I now live? Okay, in other words, there is a major transformation of human geography that's going on here. Okay, major different in which people are thinking about their relationship to the place and their relationship to the processes of transnationality. Radically different. Okay, now what I want to do is actually use the data for my argument that's based on a research project that I, along with a number of colleagues, 3 other colleagues, completed in 2016 for the Australian Council of Learned Academy, which is like British Academy, here in this country, as part of the Australian government's Securing Australia's Future project. Australian government created 11 priority projects and invited academics to work on that project in order to say what are the major future issues. And one of the issues that they identified that was important was the complexity of the relationship between Australia and Asia. Okay, the other projects were like energy and water and all those climate change and all those sort of things. As we might imagine, this was an invitation to groups of academics to imagine the future going forward. So the project that I was asked to chair was a project linked with Australia-Asia relations. Okay, and this was the project for Securing Australia's Future. This research was commissioned to investigate how Australia, now remember this is a government project, so government doesn't do anything unless it pays off somehow to their advantage, okay, might take advantage of the language skills, cultural understanding, and transnational networks that its Asian Australian communities possess. In other words, we have something of the order of 15% of our population that was either born in Asia or whose parents were born in Asia. Okay, so in other words, we have 15% of our population of 25 million who are Asian Australians. The government wanted sort of saying these people have got lots going for them. Okay, they've got networks, they've got language skills, they've got transnational connectivity, they've got business links. How can we take advantage of that? Okay, which is a project that was designed to actually understand what are the benefits. So this is a very different project, the kind of project that people have done it traditionally in migration studies. Like what are the problems do these people have? What are the issues that they have? How can we help them to settle more? This was quite an imaginative project. It was designed to actually get us to define as to how the government and the nation can take advantage of the people with these connectivities, people with their networks. This is an unusual project and indeed was highly contested within the government circles itself. They thought that they couldn't get their head around it, okay, and as a result resisted, but eventually they funded it. We were thus tasked to provide an account of the understanding of the nature and scope of Asian Australian economic contribution. Not cultural contribution, not political contribution, economic contribution. And suggest policy settings for boosting it. In other words, how can Australia and Australian businesses take advantage of all these resources that are within the country represented by Asian Australian communities. Okay, our data was based on a survey and more importantly 60 in-depth interviews with Australian business leaders, entrepreneurs in investment, each of whom had either an Indian or Chinese background. Okay, those are the two communities that we focused on, including Hong Kong. And more than half of them had come to Australia as international students, then had decided to stay on in Australia. Okay, so in other words, it's basically the international education and migration nexus that we were capturing. Okay. Our interviews revealed that each of these interviews had a very complicated relationship to Asia. The ways in which they thought about their connectivity to their country of origin was not simply, I left this country and I'm now living in Australia. It was always about what networks are useful to me that I can preserve and what networks are the ones that I can abandon. Okay? So in other words, each of them had a different narrative to present and different way of understanding their relationship. So much so that any generalizations were not possible. We also tried to give some kind of economic value to their contribution. That was impossible as well, because the numbers were just difficult to put together, compile. So as a result, we couldn't say that 15% of Australian economy is due to the networks of Asian Australia. We couldn't do that. I mean, that was just silly, because business activity is so interconnected and so dispersed that you couldn't do it. However, what became clear was neither the ethnicity logic nor migration logic was something that they preferred. They did not see themselves as migrants, and they did not want us to identify them as Indians or Indian Australians. Rather, they preferred the term diaspora. Now remember, the project did not start off attempting to understand diaspora. The data is saying to us that they prefer to characterize themselves as diaspora rather than either in ethnic terms or in terms of migration. Okay? Now this was a really interesting insight. And this is actually what pushed us to look at diasporization as a process, because they were in the processes of seeing themselves as people who were living in India, in Australia, with often Australian passports, but very close links to India or China, okay, in business terms, okay, and they were exploiting these links for whatever it was worth, okay, and that's actually what was it. While they were proud of their cultural heritage, they did not view their identity or sense of belonging to be tied to some essentialist view of ethnic origin, okay. The Indianness was important to them. But what was more important to them was some sense of Indian diaspora that was spread out around the world. Okay, not only in bilateral ways, but in a whole range of contingent, distributed kind of ways. Now this was an insight that we got. So while some viewed themselves as migrant, and only around 20% of them were happy with the term migration. Okay, the rest of the people that we interviewed preferred to use the term diaspora, of leaving a particular home to settle elsewhere, making another place at home was not the logic. So as a result, all of these people had a very complicated view of home. I mean, they would, in discursive terms, in normal conversations, sort of saying, oh, home is Sydney, or home is Mumbai, or home is Beijing. But when we drilled it down, they were deeply uncomfortable with any notion of home. Okay? When they started saying, no, home is very complicated. You know, I don't want to talk about that. It's a tough thing to do. Okay? So they were actually opposing any analytical category to explain their existence with the idea of home. They were seeing themselves as scattered. Okay? While retaining some kind of link with the Indian community in Australia, and of course links with their home communities in whichever city that they came from. Okay? So what became clear is for them transnationality is likely to shift to their sense of identity. It was not clear actually how we should describe them, okay, in any analytically precise way. It became easier for them to think about dual and even multiple citizenships. They actually would have liked to have, if it were permitted, to have 2 or 3 citizenships. They prized. These are business people, remember? They prized multiple passports. Okay? They said, saying, I don't want to give up my Chinese passport. I want to have Chinese passport, and I want to have my Australian passport. Okay? Now, Chinese government doesn't allow them to have Australian passport while keeping their Chinese passport, but Hong Kong does. Okay? So as a result, they had a very different kind of relationship, you know, and as a result, half of the people had dual citizenship. Okay, or even multiple citizenship. 3 of the people had American citizenships. 3 of them had British citizenship, on top of the Indian and Australian. So it involved complex circulation of mobility and ideas. This particular phenomenon. It did not require a sense of permanent settlement or detachment. They didn't feel happy talking about, we are detached from country. No, we are not. To us, remaining connected is absolutely important. Okay? And here we are not displaced people. We're not in exile. We are here where we want to be while remaining connected to our country of origin. Okay? Implies that it's not the individual, but networks move. So in other words, they were interested in creating communities with people like them. Okay? People who have similar kind of orientation, similar kind of beliefs, and similar kind. They were in the process of creating a new kind of community. Okay? That community that had a reference to Australia, but had reference to India as well. But the Indian reference need not be to India, but Indians in Fiji, in the United States, in Birmingham, or wherever. Okay? So in other words, they're making community as they go along. What really they prize ability to remain connected to each other using new technologies. Okay, new technologies where they can have Zoom conversations, where they can talk on Adobe Connect, where they can do all those sort of things. They really prize that. Okay, and they see it, most importantly, as this particular diasporization process as opening up new structures of opportunities, commercial opportunities in particular. They had absolutely swallowed the line that most business schools now present to their students about global economy, the neoliberal global economy. They understand, okay, and they buy into, at normative as an affective level, the line about the opportunities that neoliberal global economy opens up. Okay, and they think that opportunity is where we want to be, because that's where our opportunity. I've got to tell you that of international students, and remember, half of these people came as international students, other came as migrants or whatever other category. During their studies in higher education, they learned a particular language, a particular way of thinking about what the global economy has opened up for them. Okay, they may have realized it without the higher education, but higher education taught them about transnational entrepreneurialism, transnational possibilities of trade, transnational markets. The transnationality became the core idea that they're drawing out of their MBAs. Okay? In that sense, MBA is contributing to their image of themselves and the possibilities and the opportunities that they're able to enjoy, okay, or to be able to work. So the structure of opportunities do not simply exist. They are created. They are created with a language and set of ideas learnt in their business courses. And around 70% of the people are linked to that. So the figure of migrant in this assumes a perspective of stasis, Migrants are assumed to be a derivative figure. This is a complicated point. I'll pass that over and go to another slide. Now, while these interviewees spoke of their experiences of mobility, dispersed transnational connectivity in a wide variety of different ways, almost half of them explicitly used the term diaspora to describe the community in Australia to which they belong and to which they wished to create. Both things are important. They belong to this community and they wish to create that community at the same time. The two things are happening at the same time, okay? They're not simply a community that they have become instilled in, but they're in the process of creating that community in active ways, and I'll tell you about some of the activities. Each of them was involved in some form of business activity. That's why we interviewed them, start off with, okay? They viewed their transnational connections and experiences and their transnational possibilities in very positive terms indeed. And they use the term, this is our diaspora advantage. In the end, that's the title of our report, Diaspora Advantage. Okay, how is their diasporization converted into an advantage in a global economy that is linked to the dispersal of money, ideas, and capital, and so on? Okay, they considered the emerging transnational economic space, a dynamic and flexible space, both virtual and physical, where transnational circulation of ideas, knowledge, and people and capital can drive trade, investment, and in terms of limitless business opportunities. They'll say to me something like this: China is growing. China is changing its tastes, cultural taste, its consumption taste. There is something that Australia has given me that I can take to China. Or there is something in China that is happening that I can bring back. They're increasingly imagining the possibilities of being a cultural mediator between those two spaces. Okay, they're sort of saying, how is it that I can use it? Okay, how is it that I can in this space they were able to use their language skills, cultural understanding, and global networks to unleash their entrepreneurial energy, to take risks, and to create new business products for their local and international cultural markets. Okay, much of this work is happening in the cultural space. So these are not people who are interested in shipping iron ore to China. These are the people who are looking at service industries. Okay, industries that are about cultural products of one kind. You know, taking or bringing Bollywood to Australia. Okay, or indeed something like taking a new Australian wine to China. Those are the kind of things that they're thinking of. Okay, and what they keep on emphasizing, which was the most interesting part, was that many of these ideas I had already before I started my MBA or my business Bachelor of Commerce or whatever. But my course was highly instrumental in getting me to think and perfect these ideas so that I am doing some of the things that my course effectively and normatively taught me. So they're not looking at the course in terms of the knowledge that they had. They're not looking at the course in terms of their skills. They're looking at what is it that the course taught me that is normatively and effectively important. Okay, in other words, business schools are sites of normative transmission of effect rather than simply a set of knowledge and set of beliefs and set of skills. Okay, 70% of students in Australia, higher education at the moment, are in just 3 faculties, 3 departments, 70%. And we have international students in Australia that I think British universities would dream of. It's around 40% of all our student population, 40%. It's nearly 500,000 international students in Australia's 38 universities. This is huge. And 70% of that number, 500,000, are in three areas. Computer science, largely computer science that is business orientated, engineering, largely engineering that is communication oriented, okay, and business studies, okay, finance or accounting or something. Those are the three areas. So international education for many of these people is largely those three faculties. Not education, not humanities, not global studies, not migration studies. The numbers there are tiny compared to, 80-90% of the class in a particular first year undergraduate class being international students from 2 or 3 different countries, China, India, and perhaps one other, some place like Malaysia or something. Okay, so what we are seeing is higher education is increasingly becoming a site of business diaspora formation. Okay, business diaspora formation of diasporas. Now, diaspora doesn't get formed without some activity. So while many of the ideas are learnt in the business school, it nevertheless has to be enacted. And these people enact them quite expertly, okay, through networks with newspapers, ethnic newspapers, through television, through all kinds of things. They're bringing people together who have not been to universities, but who are bringing them into the business diaspora network that they... So employment, for example, of many people who have never been to university of Asian background are quite often employed by people who have some kind of trade activity with China or India. Some complicated networks of people who are developing these. These perceptions reaffirm new ways of thinking about concept of diaspora, how the diaspora communities are created and affected in an ongoing fashion under broad transnational conditions. These are not neatly organized political units, do not necessarily have a set of collective myths about home, nor do they feel alienated from home because they have come to, or assume an unwelcome period of settlement into an or idealized return. None of those things are the case, okay? As is quite often the case in much of migration literature, okay? This is a different kind of migration, if you like. Rather, the contemporary diaspora involve and value transnational dispersal. The scattering is a good thing because it opens up new commercial opportunities, okay? And the potential of ongoing connectivity as well as the opportunity structures provided by the globalizing economy, especially in the services sector. Now, 70% of our economy in Australia is now services economy. Services economy. And services economy is inevitably linked to cultural products or cultural exchange. Let's think about what are the major service economy items. Well, tourism and hospitality. You go to London and see how the services economy dominates that and shapes that city. Services economy includes education. Services economy involves various cultural retail, Indian shops, restaurants, etc., etc. Many of the people who regard themselves as connected do not regard themselves as connected only to the country where they are doing trade, but they are constantly imagining the possibility of ongoing connectivity that can bring them an advantage that being located within the same space cannot give them. Okay, that's basically what they're working on. So diaspora are better seen as depending not so much on displacement, but on connectivity, on the complex nexus of linkages and contemporary transnational dynamics that transnational dynamics makes possible and sustain. Their imagined community, to follow Anderson, continuously reconstructed and reinvented around a set of normative beliefs about the possibilities of global economy transnational mobility and cosmopolitan lives. Okay, the diaspora advantage is assumed to be located in these beliefs. Okay, so while they may not be very keen on cosmopolitanism, their taste and their opportunity structures for their work is quite often is. Okay, these beliefs do not, of course, apply to everyone amongst the globally mobile people and community equally, but are embedded in a neoliberal imaginary, okay, politically mobilized and promoted across a wide range of institutions, including the state and higher education. I'm saying higher education is a site where these ideas are being promoted, where the possibilities of these opportunity structures are first introduced to these people. Okay, or at least if they're not first introduced, they're confirmed as far as these people are concerned. This imaginary is embedded within the contemporary discourses of internationalization and of higher education, especially its potential contribution to human capital formation. In other words, that we are looking at the new capitalism, which is structured around services industry, in which the diaspora make a contribution of a kind that locals cannot. Okay, or so it's assumed by these people. Okay, it encourages the development of a particular kind of subject. So in other words, higher education is a site where a particular subject is being constructed for you. And people are being encouraged to negotiate and thrive in the global labor market, take advantage of the opportunities that the global economy offers, okay, especially in the services industry. In Australia, just another point about services, in Australia, services industry in 1960s, when I went to Australia, late 60s, was just 30%. It's now 70%, okay? So one of the things that we don't focus on enough when we talk about globalization is the shift from goods economy to services economy. And what does services economy consist in? What are the items of services economy? What are the activities? What are the jobs in services economy? Well, services economy has those jobs. Basically, they're all predicated on intercultural understanding or intercultural exchange of one kind or another. Tourism and hospitality, especially international tourism and hospitality, international education, and retail. And quite often, things like security as well. Okay, they're part of that services industry too. So if you look at where the jobs are, I can unfortunately reveal to you that coding is not where it is. Okay, coding provides a very few jobs. So when we are teaching in higher education, in schools of education, that you've got to teach for this new economy, these new technologies. But that's one of the jobs. What would be better for them to teach is intercultural understanding and intercultural communication, because that's where the jobs are, numerically and in terms of growth. More than half of Australians interviewed had been for applying to become permanent residents. None of them, however, wanted to what Ong calls flexible citizen. Most believed that their education, university education, had enabled them to consider how they could personally benefit from their diasporization, okay, within the transnational economic space, but could also simultaneously make a contribution to India, to Australia, and their country of origin. Now, the relationship between the country of origin is a very complex one. While they think that there is lots of opportunities, the two states are not neutral vis-a-vis what kind of opportunities they can work on. So with India in the last 20 years has basically celebrated the diaspora to come back home, remain connected with America or Britain, and develop. China, not so much. It is still going through trying to figure out how it would like to use its diaspora. So as a result, both China and India have developed policies about how they can benefit from the diaspora. Well, Australia is doing exactly the same thing. How can we benefit from the diaspora? Many countries around the world are developing policies about the diaspora benefits to them, quite often commercially. Okay, and I think that's the space in which. Just two very quick illustrations that I'll give you. Rizvi graduated with business studies at University of New South Wales and was immediately attracted to the transnational career that he wanted to have. So he didn't want to get a job in a company that was locally. He went around selling himself as somebody who had linguistic skills, who had networks and who had connections of all different kind. And basically, if you get a job for me, okay, that you want to exploit in a bank or whatever, I want that. He didn't find all that many takers. So he developed his own consultancy business. And he became a consultant, teaching people how to think about their transnational connectivity as a major advantage. Okay? And Rizvi is now providing consultancy services to Indian Australian business community as to how to take advantage of their original links with India. Okay? In other words, how can India become a resource for him? Right? Okay? There, Eddie at the University of he's in viniculture and did a master's degree in wine studies. Well, only Australia has such things, but wines. It's a whole department called viniculture at the University of Adelaide. Apparently one of the most popular ones. Whether the professors are drunk all the time or not is another question. Okay, he developed many years ago, when he was doing his course in viniculture, he went to the dean, no less, and sort of saying, look, you want to teach a course on developing wine taste in Asia. Okay? In other words, you should get somebody who has an expertise on how to get the Chinese to like Australian wines. Okay? He went to the dean. Okay? And then he said, that's a really good idea, we should think about that. And he managed to get somebody to start off at 1 unit. Now there is a major in exporting, just think about it, exporting Australian winery, viniculture tastes. Taste is an important part of that major. Okay, how do you develop taste for Australian wine when they're used to sake? Okay, or when they're used to some other kind of wine. Okay, that's basically what. So it's not the production of wine. It is the tasting and exporting of that taste. It's a very different kind of area of study. Okay, and it's linked to the kind of considerations that I'm talking about. He's now a major. He's now employed within the faculty teaching this particular course. Eddie is. Okay, and the course has gone gangbusters. It's absolutely amazing, the number of people. And do you know where they're coming from? China. Can you see what I've been trying to say? I'm trying to say that there is a community in the process of formation that is thinking about transnational connectivity and the cultural aspects of it as a major advantage to them. And they're seeing themselves as a diaspora rather than as migrants, so that they can relate to both places and the connectivity between them. For them, the connectivity is much more important than being located either in Australia or China. How can you exploit that R between the two places? Okay, and it's that R that increasingly is defining the new ways in which we might think about diasporization. Thank you.
Brilliant. Oh, don't all rush. Here we are. And please, would you say who you are? Because it's very important that we build a community.
Your name is Wester, isn't it?
Introduce yourself first, please.
Hi, I'm Becky.
From?
I'm from the UK. I'm studying the Masters in International Education and Development.
Brilliant.
I just wanted to know whether this research and sort of looked at the sort of socio-economic background of your interviewees, just in terms of being able to take advantage of this mobility and create this sort of diaspora advantage. Would suggest that they come from more potentially
privileged backgrounds.
To what extent it considers
Wonderful. So let's take a few questions then. Let's get them up. Mariam, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Mariam Amshida, and I'm a lecturer in education at the School of Education and Social Work. My question is, the formation of diaspora communities is not new, and it has been going on for ages, centuries. And the example that comes to my mind now has to do with the famous Rumi, who was born in Afghanistan, but due to in the 13th century, I think, and due to the Mongol invasion, he had to migrate, or in that sense become a refugee, and their family went to Iraq and Damascus and different places, as far as I remember, and then settled in Konya, in what's now Turkey, because they had a strong Seljuk army that had a pact with the Mongols. However, that transformation that Rumi made to that community, together with others, has made Konya iconic in that sense. And examples are from ancient India, China, and so on. My question is, to what extent has the development of nation-state offered opportunities or limitations for that kind of formation, particularly in terms of knowledge? And furthermore, to what extent has the anti-migration discourse that's going on now, particularly in Europe and in the UK, to what extent is this perhaps limiting the future opportunities of the development of diaspora, in the sense that our international postgraduate students might not have the same opportunities to stay on as the ones in the example? So this was a
brilliant.
Wow.
There are about
We've got three
questions.
You can take them now.
Yeah, take them now, yes, please.
3 questions and 1 question. Okay. Can I say something about, I mean, most of these people are clearly relatively privileged background, you know. I mean, that's not to say that we don't have migration from poorer communities, movement of people, if you like. Let's not use the neutral term rather than migration, you know. But those numbers are declining and declining very quickly. As a result of migration policies changes in Australia, where we are now increasingly focused on 2 categories of migration. Either international students who are then invited to become migrants. In other words, they're paid for their education and now make good migrants, or highly skilled migration. So in other words, migration policy itself has become a classed phenomenon. Okay, socially. So most of the new people that are coming in are not from the villages, as was the case in 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Okay, very. So the kind of language that we used once upon a time about migrant disadvantage is no longer necessarily applicable. Okay, we're looking at new things. Many of these people come from reasonably rich families, and that's why they came and did higher education in Australia in the first place. And they've done higher education, and they've got jobs, and they've got networks that they can utilize. Not everyone can. Okay? So I think the class phenomenon is absolutely central to this. But it's a phenomenon that is also central to new ways of thinking about migration policy as well. Okay? Especially in countries like, I mean, the United States is desperately trying to move towards 80% skilled migration. It won't succeed because we've got so many people, pressuring. But in Australia, they have. It's 70% now is skilled migration. Okay. Okay. So I think you're absolutely right, and that's actually something that I'm working on, trying to think about class in transnational terms rather than class in national terms. Okay, and that is a major, major agenda. There are people who've written about it, but they've written about it as a business diaspora. They have not talked about in relation to migration and socioeconomic diaspora formation. They've looked at simply a transnational elite. So people like Sclair and Robinson and people like that. Okay, so there are a number of people who are working, but I think new ways of thinking about these things are necessary. The questions that you're asking, Miriam, are really, really profound and important. Okay, the first question that you've asked relates to the mobility of Rumi. There's always been mobility. Mobility, ideas have travelled always. I mean, there is no such thing as transnational Islam without thinking about how ideas moved from a little place, Medina or somewhere like that, to Indonesia. That's a huge amount of movement, and it happened relatively quickly. Okay. Similarly, Buddhism moved, as you know, and indeed mathematics moved and all those sorts. So things have moved and have transformed local knowledges and local formations all the time. I don't think that's actually what I'm trying to focus on. What I'm trying to focus on is the ongoing connectivity, so that we are engaged with the contemporary of the changes that are taking place in your own community. Okay? In other words, we don't have a migration that is about memory and nostalgia, because you can actually talk to people in Mumbai and Delhi and Karachi and in Egypt on a daily basis. That means that you are part of that community, however removed. Okay? So I think what I'm looking at is a different kind of phenomena. Through the old mobility, where you left places and settled in another place, and then perhaps you moved again, and you left your mark in those places, like we did, of course, I mean, there's no two ways about it, and the community that he transformed the most was the community that he finally ended up in, just as you've said. But I think really didn't have the capacity to remain connected to Afghanistan in a way that there is now. You see what I mean? And exactly how he would have operated and how the two communities would have interacted with each other. If we did have iPhone, maybe we need to do a film with Rizvi with an iPhone, I think that would be a fantastic movie, some kind of imaginary movie about Rizvi with iPhone, and Buddha with our iPhone, that would be really good, as to what, or Hitler with iPhone, So let me actually say, let me actually finish off about, I have to say that one of the thing that I really find very disturbing about Brexit and about the kind of migration debates and the kind of sealing off of borders in cultural terms, what I find really disturbing is they don't understand their own economy. They don't understand their own, so there is a deep contradictions that lies at the heart of the Trumpian populism and Brexit populism, that nation-centric ethno-nationalism, which doesn't understand how the city of London, without interconnectivity, would collapse tomorrow. Okay, tomorrow, and how the services sector has transformed British economy in a way in which transnationality lies at the heart of transculturalism, lies at the heart of that. So to me, this rhetoric, of the anti-transnational or anti-global rhetoric is really quite dangerous and quite self-defeating. I'm probably displaying my colours as to where I would have voted had I been asked to vote if I had been here, or if I had been a dual citizen, as my wife is. She could have voted, but she didn't vote.
Let's have some more. Thank you. Let's have some more questions, comments, observations.
Oh,
okay. All right.
You are at the same time, so you need to decide which one starts first.
Just go for it. Just go for it. Yes, time-wise. Would you like to say who you are?
I am Ikari. I'm from Myanmar. I am doing my master's in international.
So where are you from?
Myanmar.
Myanmar. Okay.
I am doing my master's in international education and development as well. So in Myanmar, what we are currently facing right now. which brings no money into the country. I'm nothing against tourism. I'm nothing against how negatively affects.
Big issue with migrants that unfortunately many of them
The question about Myanmar is very interesting because the Chinese world over. Their model of investment is very different to the model that had applied to other countries which have done foreign direct investment. That they stay in their own hotels. They stay. But you know, Myanmar also has a very, very old Chinese diaspora that was relatively dormant. That means people didn't. They said they're Myanmar. I have come across people who sort of say to me now, for the first time, they're Chinese Myanmaris. Okay, they're Burmese of Chinese background. And they're trying to actually exploit the Chinese investment by presenting themselves as sufficiently Chinese, but with local knowledge of the markets. You see what I mean? So in that sense, there is a community that was relatively quiet about his Chineseness, that is no longer as shy about that they have created. A number of other things that China can't. That is collected by the state. So there is a whole range of advantages. Colonial model than this transnationally connected model. Okay, and as a result, I think we've got to actually do much more research. Ways in which the Chinese, of course, the government itself has opportunity. You can invest, but you can only bring X number of. And here is the level of taxation. Myanmar government hasn't done it for the fear that the investment will dry out. You see what I mean? So both the government, the people are in deep contradictory kind of situation, okay, about how to deal with them. And it's not only Myanmar, it's also Samoa, it's also Fiji, it's also a whole range of countries in Africa, Malaysia, you know, and of course, what makes it complicated is many of these countries have a significant populations of Chinese background who are seeing both advantage in it and who are seeing themselves as being connected. See, the Indians in Fiji were not all that connected to India until India started doing quite well economically, and all of a sudden they all wanted to claim that they're Indians. Yeah. Okay, they didn't 50 years ago. 50 years ago, India, it's a difficult country. I don't want to have anything to do with it. You know, so I think people are kind of like strategically making, calculating decisions instrumentally, and in ways in which you know, personal interest is quite often very, very embedded You know, so I think, I mean, I don't know, nobody actually can tell me what proportion of Myanmar's population is of Chinese background. Okay, it's so mixed, you know, that you can't actually tell who is Myanmarese originally. Background, but I'm not sure whether that's true. You would know better than that, you know. But is it quarter?
No.
It's less than that.
Yes.
Okay, all right. But I mean, I was told that it was quota, but you know, I haven't looked at it. You know, a colleague of mine called Jolie Bianco, he goes to Myanmar quite often and is working on UNICEF project in which there are Chinese involvement, because China has given some money to UNICEF to do some of these projects. But he finds that there is very little communication between the people who come to advise Myanmar and people who are local, you know. So I think there are a whole range of problems. Okay? As far as the prejudice is concerned, you know, there is a huge amount of prejudice, okay, against migrants and all those. You know, there are a huge number. Huge number of issues about exactly how you work with those prejudices is something that the governments have to pay a lot more attention than they do. You know, they're allowing things to. See, what we've got in place like Italy is really 3-4 different categories of mobile people, not one. And yet we think about them in a kind of a lumpen one category. There are the refugees, quite often very displaced and very unhappy for a whole range of reasons, quite often non-white. As a result, there are a whole range of it. Then Italy also has a huge amount of skilled migration that's coming from the IT sector. You know that, okay? Then there are some migrants from neighboring countries, okay, race included, you know, who are treated differently. And Romani people, you know, and all those sort of things. And of course, there are a large number of bits in Italy as well, as you know, especially in those beautiful places like Corsia and others, you know. Exactly what's going to happen to them, nobody seems to know, you know, and presumably they don't worry, you know. So I think prejudice is almost graded and is being practiced in different ways in relation to different communities. The skilled migration is valued, but refugees are not.
It depends.
Yeah.
There is a kind of shift in Italy. 10 years before,
yeah.
the problem was with Albanians.
Yeah.
Now, after 5 years, Albanians are fine, but people from Romania
yeah.
are not fine.
Yeah,
now, after 10 years, the problem is black people.
Black people, yeah.
We just shift.
I find in Albanians are still not fine. Romanians are still not fine, but there are even bigger problems.
But they are more integrated.
Yeah.
They can find a job, but black people cannot.
What I find interesting
There's a lot of people
is that
queuing up for questions. So
sorry.
No, I'm conscious we've only got 10 more minutes.
okay.
Over here we have yes. Tell us who you are.
Okay. My name is Louis Adekola. I'm doing my master's in international education and development as well. And so they already asked some of the questions that I wanted to ask, but it was in different forms. So I just want to ask this question because, she said the other time, this is something that we see around. It's it's what we see, but we might not pay attention to. Especially the angle of bridging the gap between academic diaspora and business diaspora that are really, really connected. But my own worry is basically in the area of, okay, what is the reason why these people are staying as diaspora in these countries? Is it because they feel that they're better off in those countries than in their country? And that, how do we differentiate between brain drain and this idea of diasporization, right? And aspect of culture and communities where people stay in small groups and building communities within these communities. I think it also, in my own perspective, and I really want to hear from you, sir, if do you think this might have higher negative effects? Because, like in the case of what she's talking about, it sets them at a very high level of target. When if something doesn't go right with that country and the country that they're coming from in terms of maybe trade agreements or anything, then something goes wrong, and then the diaspora in that country.
Vulnerability, yes.
Yeah, they are just there to suffer that.
Okay.
So in terms of labeling and these communities, do you think it has a higher advantage gaining groups of communities within?
Great, thank you. And Bindle, did you have your hand up earlier? No? Was there somebody else? Yes, it's from Japan? Yeah?
My name is Kak from Japan. Thank you so much today. So, as you know, Japan is very passive for migration.
Very what?
Very passive.
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 For migration.
Yeah.
It's a nice way of saying it.
In terms of review, what should such countries do?
Yeah. My younger brother, who is a migration policy expert, okay, he was the permanent secretary of the Department of Immigration in Australia. He has just been hired by the Japanese government to actually provide advice on how to manage their migration policies. Okay, two problems. Two problems. Japan has always prided itself as being a relatively homogeneous country. It never was. There were lots of Koreans, lots of Chinese, lots of others, you know. But nevertheless, they assumed themselves to be a homogeneous country. Never was. But now I think it is. Okay? The second thing is the Japan's population, the demography, is changing and changing very rapidly. The people who required help in the aged care sectors, okay, is kind of going up like that. The longevity is increasing of people. You know, Japan has, I mean, so that is making a difference. Plus, Japan wants to internationalize and internationalize very rapidly. One of the things that means internationalization is internationalization in terms of diaspora formation. Okay, so they want people not necessarily to become Japanese, but to become Japanese to the extent that they retain links with the other countries so that they can use the connectivity as an advantage. You see what I mean? Yes. So that's actually what's happening in Japan in a very, and I think some of the presuppositions really being thrown upside down. Really, really important time to study these issues in relation. On the one hand, the traditional conception of homogeneity. On the other hand, the necessity, economic and labor necessity of refugee. But you know, there are large number of people from Australia who are living in Japan who are perfectly happy with that, who see themselves as almost Japanese resident without having Japanese citizenship. They've been there for 30 years. Okay? And yet... So they're happy to have. Now the problem is the problem that you raised. If something happens, you know, in terms of both Australia's policies and as is indeed happening in relation to China, huge amount, and yet 8 or 9% of our population is now incredibly vulnerable. Eddie, our friend, you know, the winemaker, okay, he is worried that because of anti-Chinese sentiment in Australia, the Chinese who are patriotic are going to abandon learning the taste for Australian wines. Okay? Can you see how the things... So in other words, there are a whole range of vulnerabilities that are introduced as a result of changes in state policies and popular imagination of the other. If you make the other into the devil, as some Australian people... I mean, vice chancellors are worried sick is that they will collapse, go bankrupt, their universities. Okay? Its population, Australia is not one of the destinations. You can make a huge lot of difference, and the vulnerability is just around the corner. To strengthen the relationship. So in that sense, they are actors in what might be called public diplomacy. Where are we? You remember that? You remember the Beatles song "Nowhere Man"? Yeah. That's it. Okay. No, right, but I'm more serious. I think it is the governments are increasingly diasporas that move towards becoming business diasporas, academic diasporas who become paid. The case with Australian government, it's also the case. These students that I have are perfectly aware of this particular conflict. One stage, I had 3 students, who were deeply interested in gender relations and death. The relations as represented in social science books, textbooks. Okay. He worried sick as to whether he was deeply worried. And in the end decided to abandon that topic despite the fact that people are making calculations all the time, live in this world. But the better understanding that they have of state diasporas that are valued in the diaspora.
Major theme running through many of the questions today about how diaspora interacts, intersects with who has the opportunity to diasporize, is there a word? And who's forced
Remember, this is a government project. So the government is positioning itself, the diaspora, in a particular way in relation to its interests. Okay?